Okay, good afternoon for you, good morning for, no, good afternoon for me, good morning for you. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Can you see the screen? Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay, I just start on. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. My work is part of what we call environmental labor studies. So you see a little bit of the members of the research projects that we have had in the past and in the present. And I'm also showing these two pictures just as a little reminder of the state we are in. So this is our two pictures of the same glacier photographed in the same place. First one in 1941 and the second one in 2004. So you can just see the difference. Actually, I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction into what are the environmental crises that we are facing, because it could be that we have different ideas about what the ecological crisis actually is about. So the main theme is trade unions and just transition policies, and I'm going to talk about Germany, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. And just to show you very quickly, this is the research we have done with trade unions and about trade unions and their environmental policies in Sweden, the UK, in Spain, in Brazil, in South Africa, and in India for some years. So the structure of the talk is, as I said, first, what is the ecological crisis? Then what is just transition? Where did it begin? What are the criteria for a just transition? And then the developing and analyzing the trade union just transition policies through these criteria. So let us look first at the last or more recent research about the climate crisis. And I'm just going to show you this thing. You know, CO2 emissions in early 2022 were higher than pre-pandemic levels in early 2019. This is also very important. Ambition of new emissions reduction pledges needs to be 7 times higher to meet the 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement. So we're certainly not on track to reach this goal. Then another thing I want to emphasize is this green thing. As global warming increases, tipping points in the climate system cannot be ruled out. And one of the tipping points has already happened, which is about the melting of the ice in the Arctic. So this is going to happen by the end of this century, perhaps a few years earlier, a few years later. This ice is going to melt completely, even if we stop with CO2 emissions tomorrow. So it's a tipping point means this is a development that cannot be stopped. But that's not the whole problem. We also have disappearing habitats. So we are cutting down the forests, and that means that the animals there don't have a habitat anymore. And that means that we have a problem of biodiversity. And this is just some images to show you what kind of destruction is happening as a result of the way in which we as humans treat the environment and the planet. So humans are just 0.01% of all life, but have destroyed already 83% of wild mammals. And then you can see a little bit here on the images. Since the rise of human civilization, 83% of wild mammals have been lost, 80% of marine mammals, 50% of all plants, and 15% of fish. So we have some work to do there with the fish, right? Okay, I shouldn't be ironic about it because it is devastating. If we look, 70% of birds are chicken or other poultry, and only 30% of the birds are still wild birds. And of all the mammals on Earth, 96% are livestock and humans, and only 40% are still wild mammals. So if the loss of biodiversity continues at the present rate, then 1,058 vertebrates will have been lost between 1900 and 2050. And without human intervention, it would have taken 11,007 years for the same amount of vertebrates to disappear. What the map shows is where the highest and the lowest level of disappearance of vertebrates in the world exists. I'm not going into detail into this because this is just the introduction to the main theme. But we also have to think, when we think about the ecological crisis, about pandemics, because it's the demand for wood and minerals, and mainly from the global south, which leads to a degradation of landscape and ecological disruption. And extractivism drives those diseases because animals lose habitats and they live crowded together. They come into greater contact with humans, and that is spreading their viruses. Finally, we're not finished yet, the destructive land use. So the total land for grazing of animals is 26% of all ice-free land surface. And of that land, 20% has already been degraded by overgrazing. And if we look at the land that we use in order to grow feed crops for animals, that is 33% of the arable land. Then the problem of deforestation, 1 billion hectares has been cut in 40 years. And if we go on at that pace, it means that in 78 years, there will be no more rainforests on the earth. We have the problem of water, which we are experiencing, for instance, now in Spain, where I live. It hasn't rained here for 35 months. So our aquifers are at 20%, and there is no idea how this problem is going to be solved. And 1.6 billion of people on the earth have water shortages, and 1.2 billion live in areas of physical scarcity of water. And let's look a little bit more in detail about the way in which we pollute the water. So the industry pollutes water with heavy metals and other chemicals. Then there is sewage. More than 80% of the world's wastewater flows back into the environment without being treated or reused. And then we have agriculture, which is responsible for 70% of destruction of water through livestock waste and large quantities of pesticides, fertilizers, and so on. So if we put all these together, we must say that we do not have just a climate crisis, but we have a crisis of life on Earth. And it's very important to see that, because if we look at any kind of environmental policies, they are concentrating on the climate crisis, which is absolutely necessary. But what is problematic is to leave all the other dimensions of the ecological crisis more or less outside of the discourse and outside of the policies, and even enhancing some of the crisis by the strategies that are taken to challenge the climate crisis. So if we look at this little graph here, we can see that any kind of production, even if it's just sitting in an office and working with a computer or with paper, is based on extraction, transport, production, consumption, and discarding or waste. So that means that the earth is transformed mostly negatively, that the air is polluted, that we have scarcity of water, but also acidification, contamination, and we have the problem of human health and even human survival in some cases. We have the problem of health of other living species like biodiversity, animal cruelty, and we have also a global unequal exchange in terms of environmental issues, and I'm coming back to that. And the problem is that the mode of production which we are experiencing and in which we are included is a mode of production that is based on the necessity of competition. So it means that if you cannot compete, if you're not competitive, you're going to disappear as a business, and therefore you need to strive for economic growth, you need to strive for more profit. And you can only do that by transforming all these elements of our natural life stream in a now more and more destructive way. So the other point that we have to look at is inequalities. Many of you will know that already. Those who contribute the least greenhouse gases will be most impacted by climate change. You can see that on this map that I have put up. So the red is the high emission countries, and you see that they are predominantly in the global north. And then below, you see the vulnerability to climate change. Also, the highest is red in this map below, and you see that that is predominantly in countries of the global south, which do not themselves produce the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at inequality in another perspective, namely in terms of the poorest and the richest populations in the world, we can see that the poorest 50% are responsible for only around 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions, while the richest 10% are responsible for 49% of CO2 emissions. That is, the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of the CO2 emissions. And we can look at these pictures and also think, when we look into our countries, that this is also true for the populations within each country, not only on the global level, that the people who are poorest and the people who are working and perhaps in the middle of those 4% are producing less CO2, but they are still the objects of the effects of the ecological crisis in a much stronger way than the people who are in those 10% of the richest people. So we can say, you know, it's a lot of discourse goes on saying that we're all sitting in the same boat because we're all on the same planet, which is true, but we're not in the same seats. Some people are in first class and business, and others are in economy, and others are not even in a seat. So I want to look also into the trade union relationships of North and South, because we have done research in trade unions in the global North and in the global South. And I will read you two quotes from trade unionists in South Africa. I will, by the way, read a lot of quotes during the talk, because I think it's important to listen to the voice of the people, and even if it's only the documents of trade unions, how they talk about their policies and their fears and their perspective. So this is Gina from COSATU, and he said, "It will be a matter of time before regulations and green standards are introduced in the North to block entry of products from developing countries into markets in the developed world under the guise of environmental protection." And Mr. Jim from NUMSA, the metal union workers trade union in South Africa, said, we find implicit in some of the demands made by environmentalists in the West, which seek to place limits on growth in the developing world, nothing but eco-imperialism. So what kind of policies do they refer to? They refer to something that is called protection from carbon leakage or border adjustment transitions. And that means, and that is a discussion that has been going on for the last 20 years and is very prominent today, which is, okay, we're going to produce green steel, for example, or hydrogen, but our green steel will cost more than the steel that it is produced in other countries without all these regulations, that is black steel or brown steel. So how are we going to protect our economies from those products that come from countries that do not have the same regulations? So this is known under the word of border adjustments and the necessity to have binding regulations and import controls. So this is kind of the picture, very shortly, in which we find ourselves, or in which the trade unions find themselves when they develop environmental policies. So let's go very quickly into the historical background of just transition. The idea, though not the term, was developed by a trade unionist called Tony Mazzocchi in the US. He was a trade unionist in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union, so a union in a sector that is a very polluting and very dangerous sector also for workers. And there is this dilemma always between the environment and the jobs. Are we protecting the jobs or are we protecting the environment? So a solution for that was the idea of a just transition. That means, and I quote, that we make provisions for the workers who lose their jobs in the wake of the country's drastically needed environmental cleanup projects. And again, I quote, until recently, the environmental movement brushed aside the question of job fears with studies to prove that protecting the environment would create more jobs than it destroyed. And I have to say, this is still one of the main arguments of all the trade unions in all the countries I know of, and also the international trade unions. In the end, we will have more jobs. But Tony Mazzocchi said at the time, this position is not adequate because workers need to hear a more realistic program that provides working people with job and income guarantees. So OCAWO, that was his union, has a program to protect its members from companies dumping hazardous waste. We also need one to protect ourselves from companies dumping workers. And I just quote the red side now. So the idea that they had at the time, the trade union, was full wages and benefits until a comparative job is found, up to 4 years of education or training, including tuition and living expenses, decent pensions with healthcare for those ready to retire, develop new labor force capability for the emerging green economy. So those were the demands already in the 80s in the US. But there is another historical aspect of environmental practices of trade unionists, namely workers not being the recipients of help and support, but being themselves agents of change. And that is an example that happened very long time ago in the 70s, middle of the 70s to 80s. And those were the workers of the Lucas Aerospace companies, of which they had 17 factories in the UK, and they were going to reduce production and were going to fire workers. And the trade unionists said, this is one quote, instead of gearing up my members to react to management decisions, I was encouraging them to embrace the idea of alternatives to aerospace work. So what the workers at the time did was they did not strike, but they developed a plan how they could, with their skills, with their machines, with their tools, with their knowledge, develop a plan of how what the companies could produce instead of weapons, because the British government had reduced their money to buy weapons from those factories. So they said, we don't have to be confronted with the alternative, either we produce weapons or we're unemployed. We can develop an alternative plan to produce socially useful products. And the interesting thing is that in this plan, already in the 70s, what they did, they developed plans for heat pumps, for solar panels, for elements that were not prominent at the site. But when they were thinking of what is socially useful product, they were at the same time also thinking about how can we produce in a way that doesn't destroy the environment, which is the basis of our living and working system. So from this introduction, I derive some criteria to define and to analyze what a just transition policy is. So one background of that, and I will talk about that in the next slide very, very shortly, is what are the perceptions of the labor-nature relationship of trade union policies? How do they see that relationship? So the first criteria for understanding just transition policy of trade unions would be the mode of production. What is the role of the state? What is the role of the market? The second criteria would be the dimensions of the ecological crisis. So do they think about air, water, soil, biodiversity, or just about the climate? Third, are workers seen as agents of the transformation? You know, like in the example of the Lucas workers at the time, are they seen as people who are not just receiving support, receiving money, receiving training, which is all very important, but are they also seen as people who have ideas about how to transform their work, their production system in a way that is not destructive to the environment? Fourth, how do the trade unions address inequalities within their own country? And fifth, how do they address the problem of the global injustice between the global north and the global south? So I go according to the alphabet. So I start with the German Trade Union Federation, Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund. And as I told you, there's got to be a lot of quotes now. So I have to drink a little bit to be able to talk so much. So the first quote that you see is about defining what good work is. And good and decent work is, of course, the basis of every trade union policy. And it's defined in the following way by the German Trade Union Federation, actually by all the other unions as well. So we don't have to repeat that. It says, good work is work protected by collective agreements and co-determined. Good work is well-paid, healthy, and socially secure work. It is fair to people and gender equal. Good work is made possible by good education and opens up opportunities for qualification and development. Now, I guess nobody will be against that. But my question is, when I see those definitions of what work is, where is nature in this definition? Because we have to remember, take into account or learn or understand that every production process, and in fact also every consumption process, is based on a transformation of nature. So in my view, there cannot be any good work is this work is not only good for the people who are working, but also good for the natural resources that they are using. And that is an issue, as I said, that is a problem in all trade union policies in Europe. It's different if you go to trade unions in India and also partly in South Africa, because they have another relationship towards the labor-nature relation. But I'm not going to talk about that because I'm going to talk about Europe now. So the criteria number one, the mode of production. So the German trade union says, if market constraints and profit orientation alone determine the transformation, the environment and the majority of people will lose out. The market alone has never been successful, nor will it be looking at the challenges ahead. We need a strong and active state for the climate neutral and digital rebuilding of our economy and society. So that is quite a strong articulation of a criticism of markets and profit orientation, which is the mode of production that we are in. And so, but they're not talking about getting rid of this mode of production. They're talking about having this mode of production controlled by the state so that the destructive dimension of a profit-oriented production is controlled by state policies that kind of limit an ever-growing profit orientation of production. Number two, how do they think about the ecological crisis? So they say, the decisive factor for us is how the economic transformation towards climate neutrality is shaped. The energy, mobility, heat, agriculture, and food transition must be advanced in the coming years. So reading the whole program, and not only the central program, but a lot of programs, this is the only sentence in those programs where this trade union talks about more than the climate issue and talks about other dimensions of the ecological crisis, which are related to the way in which we do agriculture and food, that has to be advanced in the coming years. So it is there, but it's a kind of subordinated issue. Three is about including workers into the process. And they say democratic participation must not end at the factory gate. Workers are innovators who develop products and services, optimize systems, and use new technologies. Co-determination at company level is democracy at its best. In order to understand that kind of politics and that kind of perspective, one has to know that after the Second World War, the German trade union was a very important force against the fascist part of the German nation. And actually the trade unions at the time, they wanted to socialize production. They wanted to take it away from private companies, from private ownership, because it had been collaborated with the fascist state. They didn't have the power to do that. But what they were able to do was that in some heavy industries, trade unions are half of the leading body of the company. So they have the same rights as the CEOs, that is in steel and in mining. And in other companies and other industries, they are 1/3 of the ruling body of the companies is made up by trade unions. So this is something specific in the German trade union history and present, which is why for them co-determination is a very important concept. So four, what is about inequality? So of course, inequality is in the DNA of any trade union. And what is important for the German trade union in terms of environmental policy is that the climate policy needs to be designed in a way that is fair to all. The energy transition must not lead to people falling into energy poverty. And that's a very big discussion in Germany at the moment, but I'm not going into detail about it. If anybody's interested, ask a question. I can speak more about energy poverty in the global north, which is normally a concept that is used for the global south, for some people, many people in the global south. So number 5, global justice injustice. Here I quote, ensure that technological development and the associated industrial production do not take place outside of Germany, which would inevitably lead to job losses in this country. We demand that policymakers at national and EU level effectively protect companies from unfair competition with suppliers from other countries who gain international competitive advantages through human rights violations, wage, social, environmental, and climate dumping. So you might remember border adjustments, not letting products in that have been produced not under strict regulations and are therefore cheaper, and the fear of trade unionists in the global south that this will happen. And this is, in fact, something that is demanded by all the trade unions and in their just transition policies in the European trade unions and also in the trade unions of the US. So actually, global, the control of the borders is a big part of trade union policies, which means, if we want to criticize it, that the just transition policies of trade unions in Europe and in the US are, let's say, limited to their national members. And there is not so much, how could I say, knowledge or policies that would develop something like an insight into the global value chain and the necessity of global solidarity. But there is something here which the German trade union says: we will intensify our engagement so that international human rights, labor, social, consumer, and environmental protection standards are further developed and better enforced along global supply and value chains, as well as in trade agreements. So this is also called in trade union speech to create a level playing field. That is okay, we don't want these cheap products coming into our country, but we will fight for a regulation of production processes in other countries so that they also have human rights and environmental protection. And then we will have a level playing field and therefore a more fair trade relationship. So let's go to the next trade union, which is Comisiones Obreras here in Spain. And you can see 2 logos there because the Spanish trade union is really special in terms of their environmental policies. First of all, they have a research institute, ISTAS, which is a research institute for health and the environment. And they have this research institute already since 1992 or 1993, I'm not sure, but as you can hear, very, very long ago. So when you go to Comisiones Obreras or you go to ISTAS, you will find so many documents about their environmental policies, their environmental projects, their environmental demands. You cannot find that in any other union that I know of. And maybe some of you will be surprised. People are always surprised in international conferences when I say that, because they have this idea that there is a north-south relation within Europe. So the best environmental policies come from Sweden And of course, the more you go to the south, the less trade unions and people in general are interested in environmental policies. And this is absolutely not the case. It's actually the other way around. And why is this the case? Also, a little bit of history of that trade union is always necessary to get a little bit into the history and into the character of the trade unions in order to understand their policies. So in the case of Comisiones Obreras, they were founded during Franquismo, fascism, Spanish fascism, and they were forbidden until I think 1967, and then they had a lot of limits to what they could do. So they were a social movement, and they are organized still as a social movement. So they're organized in sectors like any other confederation, but they're also organized in territories. So because of that history as a social movement that is, of course, trying to change society as a whole and not just the workplaces, so they have a broader perspective of what trade union work should be, and therefore they started their environmental work already in 1991 with the first representative for environmental issues in a trade union board that I know of. Of course, there are still a lot of conflicts within the union about that. The job versus environment dilemma is not solved, is always discussed and always conflictual, but nevertheless, there are a lot of policies about towards environmental issues. So number one, the mode of production. I quote, "The analysis of the situation arising from COVID-19 clearly shows the traces of the social and environmental crisis that we have been suffering as a consequence of our model of globalized economic and financial growth. We need instead, one could say, a strengthening of the public sector, transport, water, waste management, energy increases of social services, health, education, care." So this is very interesting because I wouldn't say, or nobody could say, that the Comisiones Obreras are a trade union which is in favor of degrowth, decrecimiento, but it is a discussion in the union whether unions do not have to face the fact that economic growth in terms of money and ever new products that people do not really need, if that can go on, if we want to save the natural conditions under which we can survive. It's not a general Comisiones Obreras policy, but it is a discussion, and you can see it here when it says the model of globalized economic and financial growth is a problem. Second, the ecological issue. So because of the long history of the Comisiones Obreras of environmental policies, they do not only talk about climate change, although they talk a lot about that, but I'm just putting here a quote where they talk about all the other issues that need to be solved if we want to survive on the planet. So reconsider the industrialist agricultural model, industrial livestock farming based on large-scale farms and high meat consumption in Western countries, ecological restoration and protection of biodiversity, limiting land use change, protect and increase the diversity of habitats, control invasive species, recover wetland, control desertification, and reduce soil erosion. Of course, this is also true because here in Spain, we are faced a lot with all of these problems, especially, for instance, desertification, as I told you in the beginning. So what about workers' inclusion as agents? So there is just one sentence: just transition agreement must include unions and local actors. Just transition agreements is also something that is specific to Spain because they had to close down all the coal mines. And in order to make a just transition there have been just transition agreements between trade unions, the state, and the companies. And it's another very, very long story that I could tell you about, but I'm not going to. But I'm just quoting this here now because for this union, it is not only important to include the workers in the transition process, but also the local actors, the local communities, because the closing of a mine, of course, as you will all know, means that also a lot of economy that is related to the mining is going also to fall apart. Number 4, what about inequality? Just one quote from a research project that they did about how people with very low incomes see the ecological crisis and what their perspective is. And in this research project, they say, when we imagine the technological and sustainable future, we rarely think about how these transitions affect the invisible society. Few ask how the most vulnerable people will make a living. I'm not going more into detail because I can see on my phone here that my time is almost up. So number 5, reduce the consumption of energy, water, and superfluous goods in the context of scarcity of raw materials and global chemical contamination. So they have a relationship to global context within which all production takes place, but it's not very developed. It is just an element. What they have, though, is not such a strong emphasis on developing Spanish industry and economy. Of course, they have an emphasis on it, but it's not in a way that we have to be competitive in order to compete out other economies in other parts of the world. So we come to Sweden, IF Metall. I cannot talk about the Swedish Confederation, which is the confederation that includes all the different sectors of the Swedish economy, because they don't have a program of environmental policies in this organization. They have a blog, they have notice, and they have news from time to time, but they don't have a program. But the Swedish Metal Workers Union has a program. And we start with number 1, the model of production. And they say we need to contribute to the development of European cooperation with a well-functioning internal market without harmful state aid and protectionism, and with free and fair world trade. So it's quite opposite of the other trade unions that we have heard of and will hear. The other trade unions are indeed into controlling the economy through state politics and state regulations, while for the Swedish Metal Workers Union, state aid is harmful protectionism. Number 2, what about how they define the ecological crisis in terms of the politics that they develop? Gear up investments in carbon capture and storage, make the reform of the environmental and permit processes a fast reality so that mining and other basic industries can grow and develop in Sweden. Circular economy is a prerequisite for an environmentally and climate smarter society, and also provide great business opportunities for Swedish industry. So the industries that they are supporting and want to develop are ones that are, one would say, in a discussion whether carbon capture and storage is really possible, how much of that will be possible, and to develop mining and other basic industries in Sweden and in other parts of Europe can also be seen as importing the destruction that mining is about, as I have shown in the beginning a little bit, into the European context. In a way, one can see that as a positive thing, so that the Europeans can experience actually how destructive mining and other basic industry extractivism is, not only for the earth and for the habitats of animals, but also for the people living around those mines. Number 3, there is nothing about how to include workers into the process. That's number 4. And number 3, there's also nothing about inequality and fighting against equality in the program. I'm not saying that the Swedish Metal Workers Union is oblivious to inequality, but it's not important enough to put it in their program. I think one can say that. So number 5, the global perspective. The trade unions say, securing the future with the world's best industrial workers. For us, I mean, I have lived in Sweden for 15 years because I'm still working at the University of Umeå in Sweden, although not physically. I only do research, so I don't have to be there. Sverige är bäst, Sweden is best. It's really a mantra that you hear all the time in the Swedish context by different social actors. And it's again here part of the environmental policy, securing the future with the world's best industrial workers. Skills are crucial for Sweden to be a winner in the global competition. Industry is global, true. Equally true is that every workplace exists in a local and regional reality. Therefore, the region's efforts to promote growth, skills, and industrial development need their own and nationally supported capacity to reach the workplaces. Now, you can, I think, already see that I'm quite critical of purely national idea about fighting against climate change and the ecological crisis. And it's very much developed in the Swedish context that you can beat the climate crisis by developing more industry and being the best developers of alternative industries, of hydrogen, of green steel, and export that into the world. And then we will not only not have any problems with climate change, we will also be better off than before. Although for the several reasons that you might have already seen in my introduction, I'm quite critical of that position, I also want to say that we have to take into account that the transformation, and not only the ecological, but also the digital transformation, will really be very detrimental to workers' jobs and workers' future. So you can kind of understand trade unions when they try to fight against the job losses that are going to happen by trying to develop their national industry in a green growth model. However, what one should also take into account that indeed every workplace is global and that you cannot solve a global value chain development and a globalized production processes by just concentrating on your own national production. At least that's what I think. So finally, this is the last. We have the Trade Union Congress in the UK, and I'm going a little bit quicker now, although they don't deserve this. But number 1, the model of production, the key shift we need is from an economic model based on growing now and distributing later to one that sees growth and equality as two sides of the same coin. So it's a growth model that is necessary, but a growth model that is also based on equality. Number 2, what is the ecological crisis? UK trade unions have long supported a balanced energy policy, measures to reduce carbon and other harmful emissions from energy-intensive industries, a just transition to electric vehicles, and an integrated low-emission public transport system. Key technologies include carbon capture, storage, and use, nuclear energy at scale, with direct government investment in order to create high-quality employment. So this is also very similar to the Swedish perspective that we can, industrialize ourselves out of the climate crisis without taking much into account that all the industries that have to be developed in order to reach that way of getting out of the climate crisis does produce other ecological crises. So the workers' voice must be embedded in these plans, whether through the promotion of collective bargaining at the workplace level, enterprise and sectoral level, or using a social partnership model to ensure equal voice between government, workers, and employers. So this is also very much a perspective, not also, but this is very much a perspective of hearing workers' voices through the voices of their representative about the trade unions. Although they have the history of the Lucas Plan, as I said in the beginning, there is not so much about using workers' skills in order for workers to become the agents of change. Although there are pockets within the trade unions in the UK that are fighting for that. And I will come to that at the end very, very shortly. Number 4, the TUC has a long history of supporting policies to reduce inequality and deprivation. The gap between the richest and poorest region in the UK is around 150%. The gap between the richest and the poorest regions in the UK is almost twice as large as in France and 3/4 larger than in Germany. So what is interesting in this quote is that this is not so much about inequality. They have that, of course, as well. Inequality between individual citizens, but is the inequality of regions in the UK. So how can they develop a policy and a just transition policy in different ways in different regions, because already different regions are affected of the climate crisis and the measures against it in different ways. Finally, trade unionists noted that only the blades of wind turbines are built here in the UK, with the turbines themselves being built overseas. Buying steel from China can produce up to 50 times more carbon than sourcing from the UK. So this is important from the perspective of both UK industry and environmental objectives. So again, it is closing our borders to other kinds of products, and not only that, but trying to introduce the production of certain necessary machines for renewable energy into the trade union economy and production process. So I'm summing up, and I'm summing up with questions that come out of this presentation, I think. So although you are supposed to ask me questions, I can also ask you questions. If you were a trade unionist, how would you include not only union representatives, but also shop floor workers in industry service administrations as agents of a just transition? And as I said before, there are pockets of trade union groups. For instance, in Unite, they call themselves Grassroots Climate Justing Caucus, and they are actually aviation workers, and they want workers' assemblies in order to develop green policies that are based on including the skills and the knowledge of workers. They say we need to develop an independent worker-led vision of the future for aviation. And that includes, if you look at the documents, also less aviation and less jobs in the aviation sector, but another kind of aviation also. So another question is how to change the perspective from a climate-centered policy to one that addresses the complexity of the ecological crisis. And why is that necessary? I give you just one example very shortly. You know, we talk about renewable energy. All the trade unions, all the politicians, a lot of scientists talk about the need of renewable energy as if that would save us. But the renewable energy machines are actually not all renewable. They need a lot of minerals and a lot of excavation and a lot of metals. And here is an analysis of engineers who say that if we would take all the energy that we're using now without growing it at all, if we would take that and would shift that to renewable energies, we would not have enough lithium, cobalt, and nickel in order to produce the machine to harness that energy from the sun and from the wind. Just a short example why it is necessary to look at the complexities of the ecological crisis. And also how to reconcile the need for jobs on a national and regional level, which is absolutely necessary, with the survival needs of workers in the global value chain. And I give you just this example of producing lithium, because we know that electric cars and so on and so forth, we're going to use masses of lithium that at the moment don't even exist. The production of lithium consumes between 5 and 10 million cubic meters per year. The people living in Salar del Hombre Muerto, this in Argentina, where lithium is produced, consume between 6,000 and 70,000 cubic meters per year. So Jorge Cruz, as an example, says he cannot raise animals anymore due to the lack of fresh water. And finally, really finally, how to change the merely human-centered concept of decent work to one that includes decency towards nature. Or in other words, how to change the question from replacing lost jobs with more and better jobs to the question of how we can work and live within planetary limits and still have a good life, like living together, being able to care for other people in a gender equal way, develop our creative capabilities, have less paid employment together with a basic income, and have also time to do political work and improve our societies. Thank you very much.